Welcome to my American History Notes, where I discuss conclusions I've drawn from studying American history. I read trusted historians. I then go to things they've referenced. I look at primary sources like journals, letters, newspaper accounts, laws, and then try to understand what's happened. And you may not agree with my conclusions, but you should know about the events that I talk about. If you don't know about them, then look them up. So we're going to begin talking today about the conquest of America, which is really, I'm going to start with a Bible verse. I want you to understand something very important first. Acts 17:26 says, "And hath made of one blood all nations of men for to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation." So let's begin. As the 250-year long War of Conquest of North America was in its early stages. Now, if you think that's a crazy thing to say, a 250-year long war of conquest, well, don't think for a second that when the Normans invaded England that it was all settled at Hastings. It took a long time to bring England, all of England, under the Norman heel. Um, don't think that before that the Anglo-Saxon conquest of Britain, Roman Britain, what had been Roman Britain, happened in one battle or at one time. It was a long process of migration, punctuated by violent encounters, some of which are very noteworthy. But a conquest of a people, and we've been so used to talking about Indians and Native Americans in a very patronizing way. We refuse to see that this continent was composed of many nations, many tribal groupings of people who had their own language and culture, who engaged in warfare, who allied with each other and opposed each other. All the things that were happening in Europe with a different level of technology were happening here. So this place was very populated at one time before disease and conquest sealed the deal, so to speak. So we're going to talk about this for a few sessions. But in the early stages, the Native Americans, and I'm going to call them Indians and Native Americans interchangeably. If that offends somebody, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to understand that when you're reading history, they're going to be referred to Indians an awful lot, okay? But say, now they could have succeeded in driving the European out, but their petty jealousies and squabbles, um, they could not put them aside. And so Europeans allied with them, they allied with Europeans, they went against each other. So they did not have an enlightened immigration policy. Let's put it that way. If the Native Americans had had an enlightened immigration policy, we wouldn't be talking here, okay? So the relations with Europe and Native Americans were inconsistent, say the least. There were negotiations to secure land for the colonists from the Indians, whose idea of ownership of land often did not include exclusive rights to the land, although this varied from tribe to tribe and region to region. The Indians were sometimes cheated out of their land, and the more sedentary Indians suffered along with the hunter-gatherer, as the former lost land for cultivation of their crops, and the latter lost their hunting range, a disaster for both. There were men like Roger Williams who insisted upon a fair exchange when land was to be purchased, and men like Eleazar Wheelock who founded the Ivy Leagues, Dartmouth College, to bring Christianity to Native Americans. But a great many colonists, particularly in the New England area, viewed themselves. It's very important to understand how the colonists viewed themselves and how they viewed the Indians. The New Englanders, many of them viewed themselves as a type of new Israel, and the Indian as a type of Canaanite who was to be driven out. They used the Bible as an excuse. There are recorded instances of Indians being shot as nothing better than wild dogs, and arguments were held, believe it or not, were held on whether or not, I've read them, an Indian or an African slave even had a soul. As a result of the tensions resulting from the need for more arable, that's farmable land, and land for new towns and settlements, there were many open conflicts in colonial America against Native American populations, and sometimes military actions were executed with Indian allies, either against other Indians or against the colonies of other European countries. Remember, Cortez in Mexico, not in our area of study, he could not have conquered the Triple Alliance, the Aztecs, without the help of Indian allies. Okay, just keep that in mind. Um, it's not all cut and dried. Like slavery and racism and everything else in history, things are complicated. Okay, I mentioned the 1622 Indian massacre at Jamestown that led to reprisals by colonists against the native inhabitants. It's kind of curious. The first battle between the Columbus Spaniards and the Native Americans resulted in defeat for the European at Navidad, the settlement that Columbus left behind. They were wiped out in battle. And the first battle in North America between the Indians and the European was a massacre at Jamestown. So they were starting off 2-0. Okay, um, but that led to reprisals by colonists against the native inhabitants. Between 1675 and 1676, Susquehannock warriors crossed the Potomac River into Virginia and conducted a series of raids, even fighting back a joint Virginia-Maryland force at Piscataway Creek. The raiding intensified and many frontier homes were abandoned. Critics of the Governor Berkeley of Virginia attacked his refusal to send a punitive force and accused him of having a personal interest in the fur trade and not wanting to upset the Indians, which brings us to our next topic in American history, and to understand that this was an argument about Indian policy, and it also had a very big impact on the future of racial slavery, because at this time we're still in the era when your servants, your bonded servants, they're people that were under a specific time frame. They were not servants for life necessarily, although they could be cheated out of that. But so we can now come to Bacon's Rebellion, which has an impact on relations with Native Americans. It also has an impact on slavery. So I just want to read a couple of things from history. In 1624, Captain John Smith had warned that basing the colony on chattel bond servitude was bound to, quote, bring Virginia to misery. 50 years later, a revolt that had been brewing since about 1660, when tobacco prices began to fall, fulfilled that prophecy. And no other event of Anglo-American colonial history has received so much attention from historians as Bacon's Rebellion, which tore the Virginia colony apart for nearly 9 months in May of 1676. And there's been lots of interpretation of that event and what it meant to our history. Many people say that it led directly to the American Revolution, but what it led to immediately was the fact that when you have black servants and white servants uniting together under an aristocrat to fight the established authority, then what happens is the power class has to separate them somehow. And so they created, for their own preservation, a completely black African-American underclass, a peasantry of slaves, so that the white laborer began to associate himself not as, hey, we're all suffering, but I'm better than they are, at least. And that will come later. But right now we're talking about Bacon's Rebellion. Now, in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon, a civilian, he was sick of Berkeley not wanting to attack the Indians. He led a force to the Roanoke River, and he destroyed a band of Susquehannocks. He was labeled a traitor and arrested, but was eventually pardoned by Berkeley. Bacon then marched on Jamestown with a force of 500 men, black and white, and demanded a commission as a military officer. Again, he was declared a traitor, but with Berkeley unable to get military support against him, the governor fled. In September 1676, this all started in May, the insurgents ousted Berkeley's troops and burned Jamestown. A month later, Bacon died of malaria, and with the sudden death, the rebellion fell apart, with the result being the execution of 22 insurgents and Berkeley being censored by the crown. And this has a lot of impact on our relations with the Native Americans. It also has to do with slavery, which we'll come to later. We're going to discuss Native American versus colonists in New England next. And remember, the New England colonists, many of them, the religious ones, and most people were religious, viewed the Indians as Canaanites, and this was New Israel. And they were justified in driving them out because the Israelites did that to the Canaanites. So keep that in mind, that thinking in mind, and we'll come to this next time. I hope this, even if you don't agree with my conclusions, at least you should know about this and be studying it on your own. If you want to say you know American history, quit just taking somebody else's opinion and dig, look yourself. Okay? Thank you.